Okay, welcome to the second session today in the Building Promise During COVID-19 room. Our next session is called How Kids Are Performing, Interpreting Assessment Scores in This Most Unusual Era. And your presenters are Dr. Jean Kearns, Vice President and Chief Academic Officer of Renaissance, and Jan Bryan, also of Renaissance. We will be recording this session. Okay, Jean, it's all yours.
Right. Very good. So I'm here today to actually give you all a sneak peek, if you will, a little bit of a preview of a report that is going to be released by Renaissance on the 1st of December. And of course, it only took a matter of weeks after our schools closed before people began to ponder about what would be the academic impact, which many people have framed as either pandemic slide or the COVID slide. Is the one that I hear the most. And so the report that we're going to be releasing, again, that I'll be previewing for you is available to anyone. You don't have to be a STAR customer or a Renaissance customer to get access to this report. And it will be a very significant one because it'll be one of the most significant ones in terms of calculating the COVID slide. And so here is a URL that I will put back up again a little bit later in case you'd like to sign up to get a copy of this report. Maybe you want to jot it down now or we'll revisit it later after you've seen what's going to be in the report and maybe make a more informed decision about whether or not you'd like a copy. But again, December the 1st for release of this report titled How Kids Are Performing, subtitle there, Tracking the Impact of COVID-19 on Reading and Math Achievement. And you can pre-order this at renaissance.com/performing. As Deborah said, my name is Jean Kearns. I serve as the Chief Academic Officer and Vice President at Renaissance. I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Jan Bryan. Jan's going to be helping us out on the chat. So she's over in Hoover watching your chat. We encourage you to chat, to pose questions. I'm going to stop at several points along the way and ask Jan in case any questions have come up. So please do use the chat feature if something pops to mind. And there's also a couple of instances during the presentation where I'd like to get you to make some predictions. And of course, you're going to use the Hoover chat to do that as well. And so Jan's going to be my eyes and ears over there to help me know what it is that you all are predicting. At Renaissance, we always like to begin by acknowledging our mission, which succinctly stated is to accelerate learning for all children and adults. And the reality of it is, hasn't that become a bit more complex over the last year? I mean, who saw what we've been going through coming at us? And clearly, when we talk about the COVID slide, it's not a matter of whether there has been one. I don't think anybody questions that. I mean, there's no way that schooling can be as disruptive as it was without there being some type of impact. The question is not, is there or is there not a COVID slide? The question is, how significant is it? And how much work will we need to do to catch kids up? So again, the COVID slide, how big is it? Now, there have been some other reports that have been out there, and I want to make sure that you understand how the report that we are offering up is different than some other ones. So for example, you see two widely circulated ones. The one on the left particular got a lot of exposure for a while. It appeared in the New York Times. There was part of a story in CNN that referred to it. For a period of a couple of months, I barely could pick up the educational journals for any given week and not find some reference to this study. But if you look really closely right underneath the title section of that report on the left, you can make out the date if you've got good glasses like mine. And what it says is April of 2020. Now think about the things that we thought about all of this back in April of 2020. Back in April, we almost had an idea that some kids might make it back into the building for some instruction at the end of the school year. And in April, we still had this idea that, yeah, regardless of what happens, this spring, we'll all be back in the fall, right? Well, we know how that story ended. So the first thing I want you to understand, you see April on the report on the left, you see August on the report on the right. Immediately, what these dates should let you know that sometimes people don't take in well is that these reports were predictions or projections. In other words, no kids had actually come back to school. So we could not definitively measure how they were performing. And so as far back as April and continuing up through August and even after that, there have been a variety of reports that came out that were just that, predictions. Often these predictions looked at the historical summer slide. So what do we know about what goes on with kids while they are away from the building? We know that they regress to some degree during their summer breaks. And so often what these reports did is they treated the entire COVID period as if it were a very elongated summer period. Now, there's some credence in that. I mean, obviously kids were away from buildings and they were not getting normal delivery of instruction. So in some sense that makes, some good logic. However, I don't know about you, but I don't feel like the work that we did back in March, April, May, June felt like a summer. Usually my summers were a bit more relaxing than that because schools all over the country did all manner of work to make sure that something continued in the name of learning. And if learning continued, then that might not have been like a normal summer. So the projections might have been a little bit off. But summer slide was really the only thing that folks could use at the time to make some projections. Now, the problem with these projections is some people took them too literally, and some people took them too far. So, for example, here's an article, September the 22nd, making the statement that says, study shows major learning loss. And even though this was in September, it was still too early for it to be on actual data. If you actually read this article, it refers back to one of these earlier studies that we took a look at. So the reality of it is the title of this article that says study shows major learning loss wasn't really accurate. A better title for that article would have been Study Predicts Major Learning Loss. Here was one that went really far. Early part of October, this article ran and it said, here's the 5 states where the COVID slide has hit students the hardest. Again, that was based on predictions, not actual back to school data. But the good news is this. And actually just kind of one more thing about the statement of there. Paul Van Hippel, who is a professor at the University of Texas, Austin, said, what a lot of people did not understand about some of these earlier reports was that they were statistically informed guesses. There were statistics, there was models, there was a lot of hard work, there was a lot of good thought. But at the end of the day, we had to understand that these things were guesses. And Megan Caulfield, who actually wrote the most widely circulated report, the one that came out in April, she said, quite honestly, these reports took on a life of their own. And perhaps more concerning, they were sometimes spoken about with far more confidence than the researchers who wrote them had in them themselves. They were trying to estimate something. They were trying to make a prediction. And some people went so far as to take these reports and begin to turn them into policies. Well, the good news is the time for predictions is over. Kids have come back to school. And as they've come back into school in schools across the country, millions of interim assessments have been given. So we no longer need to rely upon those predictions. We can talk about the realities that are seen within the data. So a couple of things that make the report that I'm about to preview to you a little bit different. First, it is one of only a small handful that is based on actual back to school data, not predictions. Secondly, it is the largest that has been released so far. So what I'm about to show you is based on assessment records from over 5.3 million students. A little more than 3 million students taking reading assessments and a little bit more than 2 million students taking a math assessment. It's also the first national study of the topic. Again, I said there's some other reports out there that did look at actual back to school data. The largest one that I'm aware of involves students from 9 states, where the research sample of the report that we're about to preview involves students from all 50 states. and DC. So in terms of both its size and its scale of student involvement, the results should be very generalizable. What is the source of the data for this report? It is the students taking millions of STAR reading, math, and early literacy assessments as they've come back to school. Now, STAR is a reliable and valid test that produces percentile ranks. Maybe you don't use STAR, and that's just fine, because I'm sure whatever interim assessment tool that you use, it's almost always the case that those tools will produce for you a percentile rank for students. So even if you don't use STAR, you can use the nationally representative sample, which we're about to show you, and we can talk about to what degree have there been decreases in students' performance in a percentile metric, and you can use your own data to compare to that to see in some ways how your school or district level slide compares to that at the nation. So here's the questions that we were seeking to answer. First of all, how does performance this fall compare to what we would have thought was typical or what we expected under a normal year? Secondly, is there a greater range in performance? Because what some people said was the COVID disruptions might have widened existing achievement gaps. Are there particularly impacted grades or subject areas more than others? What about demographic subgroups? Many people have suggested that it's highly likely that sadly some of our most disadvantaged students may be disproportionately impacted. And also too, there's been some predictions out there that it's likely that we might see that students who attend school in more rural and small town areas might have been disproportionately impacted because so much of what we did throughout the spring and over the summer relied upon distance learning. And in more rural areas, you may not have the same access to high-speed internet. So perhaps kids in more rural areas might have been disproportionately impacted simply because they could not get online to the same degree that some of their colleagues have. So here's what I want to show you. I want to show you overall how kids are performing. We'll get a big, broad picture of what the drops have been. We'll then take a look at performance by subgroups. And after that, we'll talk about, which is a really important thing, how do we make meaning of these scores? What does this mean in terms of, for example, how many weeks behind kids are? And then finally, as any major research study does, we will talk about the limitations of our findings and the questions that will remain open, things that we could not answer that certainly deserve some attention. Now, this brings us to the first poll question, and I say poll question, but we can't poll easily through this, so we're going to use Whova Chat. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you two questions, and please use Whova Chat to respond to those questions. And then Jan's going to be my eyes and ears on that chat feed, and she's going to let me know what you guys are saying, okay? So get ready with your Whova app and get ready to chat. Here's the first question for you. In this report, we're able to discuss reading and math performance. Between those two subject areas, reading or math, those are your options. Which one do you think will be more impacted? Which one's going to have larger drops in performance? Is it reading or is it math? What do you think? Jan, let me know what you're seeing.
Almost instantaneously, the first two were math. Very quick response. Math. We're still seeing math overwhelmingly.
All right. And I'll tell you, again, the spring and the summer, the journals had every manner of predictions, and that was a pretty consistent one. And it makes a lot of sense because we know that math is highly sequential. It is a lot harder for students to move ahead on their own in math than it is in reading. In fact, in reading, there's a clear body of research that shows if students read a modest amount daily while they're away from school, they tend not to regress all that much at all. So yeah, that's a pretty good prediction. We'll see whether it came true. Wink, wink, it did. Now here's another one. This one's been harder. And here's an example of where some of the predictions actually have not come true. So the next question is, what grade level, and you have to name just one if you can narrow it down to that, what grade level or grade levels, if you want to do a little bit of a range, you can't go like K to 12 has been impacted. I'll allow you to do plus or minus like 2 grades. What grade level or grade levels do you feel like has likely been the most impacted by our recent schooling disruptions? Now, that one's probably a bit more of a Wild West kind of feed for you, Jan. Sorry.
That's fine. We've got K to 3, 4 to 5, 7 to 8, TK through 12.
All the bets are covered there. What else?
Right. We do have a K through 12.
Okay. That's not allowed. I said you could put a bet on everything. There's no way to lose that one.
We've got K3, 4 to 6, and 7 to 8 at this point. Okay. Yes. And then we do have the K to 12.
And I might have primed the pump a little bit there because we had that article up there that said K to 3. And honestly, there were a lot of predictions that it would be K to 3. Well, remember what I said, though, the time for predictions is over. It's now time for us to talk about the realities. So let's start opening up the curtain. Now, again, the report's coming out on the 1st of December. I can't show you everything. It's kind of like a movie. You don't get the whole story. You just kind of get the theme and the trailer. So I'll give you a feeling for what's going to be in there. And then again, I'll have the slide up at the end if you'd like to sign up to get a copy. For reading, here's what we're seeing. The reading impacts are not all that severe. So overall, across the grades that we looked at, and we're only able, and it would take another 20 minutes to explain the methodology, so just go with me here. We're only able to really target grades 1 through 8. And across grades 1 through 8, the performance down year over year is down roughly 1 percentile point. So I'm just throwing out random numbers here, so it's not an example one. So for example, let's say that in a given grade, normally kids were starting the year somewhere around the 50th percentile. They're now starting somewhere around the 49th percentile overall. Now, the most impacted grades, the grades where we see the hardest hit, those grades are about 2 percentile points behind. So if they were starting at 50, before, they're now starting somewhere around 48. So here's some good news for us, because some of the predictions that were out there were incredibly dire. So for example, I know there was one webinar done by one group that literally used the words "lost COVID generation" in their title. Not quite the case. There was a tutoring center, and of course, they have a motivation to do that. Tutoring center saying some students may never recover. And in terms of reading, we're just not seeing impacts that are quite on that level of being dire, lost in the woods, or unrecoverable. Math, however, as you predicted very accurately, is far more impacted. So the extent of slide that we're seeing in reading is roughly only 1/4 to 1/5 of what we're seeing in math. Mathematics overall is down about 7 percentile points year over year. And in the most impacted grades, we see drops more on the magnitude of 10 percentile ranks. I'll go ahead and let you know, grades 4 and 5 for math, they're the most impacted. They are the -10 grades. They also happen to be some of the grades that are -2 in reading. So if you understand that those 2 grade levels are starting the furthest behind with math and the furthest behind in reading, then clearly grades 4 and 5 took the hardest brunt. Grade 3 is just behind them in terms of impact in reading, as is grade 5, a little bit less in grades 6 and 7, but still very, very legitimate. So clearly with math, we have some work to do. Now, we also want to frame the same information in different ways, just so you can begin to understand, well, what does this mean for us in terms of schooling? And what we're looking at is our screening categories that are based on the RTI and the MTSS models. If you see kids that are green, they are meeting or exceeding a very widely used benchmark. So kids that are green, they're about where they need to be. That's great. Kids that are blue, they are on watch to us. They're close to the benchmark, but we'd like them to be performing higher. Therefore, they're on watch. The yellow and red categories, those are kids that are likely, very likely, to be in some form of an intervention in their schools. You see the percentile ranks corresponding down there. Red is being below the 10th percentile. Yellow is being above the 10th, but below the 25th. And what you're seeing is we're showing you year over year. So for reading, there's not a whole lot of change. Some of these categories change by maybe 1%, but year over year, not all that bad. However, last year in 2019, any given grade where you might have seen the red, yellow, and green, or excuse me, the red, yellow, and blue categories take up this amount of space, they're taking up a lot more space this year. That means there are more students below the benchmark. If you add this all up, it's roughly 8% more students falling beneath the benchmark. So the other day I was on a phone call with a district that has 196,000 students. For them, if they have roughly 8% more students under the benchmark, that's roughly 16,000 kids below the level of performance they want. What this means is we're going to have maybe more students who are going to be in the need of extra services. So we begin the report by talking about performance. And then we transition into, well, what would that look like through the lens of growth metrics? Now, at Renaissance, we use a metric that many states also use. It's called the student growth percentile. And what it does is it reports growth to you in a format that is very normative in nature. In other words, if a student has an SGP, standing for student growth percentile, of 50, that's right in the middle, normal growth. So you look at periods over time. If growth is running in the 50s, it's very, very average growth. Anything that is higher than 50 is, starting to be better, more towards above average growth. Anything that is below 50 is a little bit less than desired. And generally speaking, it's about 65 or above where people really start celebrating the growth that students are having. And it's roughly 35 or below when the red flags start going up, that growth is below normal. So what this means is if you look at growth across the country through the lens of SGPs, if you were to look at the 5.3 million kids that we have in there for both reading and math, in a normal year, if you were to look at how they are growing on this metric, the scores would hover somewhere right around 50. That might be 49, 48, 51, 52, something like that. But in a sample size as huge as the numbers of kids reflected in this report, everything would have hovered right around 50 for a normal year. But then here came 2020. So let me show you the SGP for the most impacted area, which you understand is math. I'll show you the average SGP for our nation last year. 35. So what that means is that COVID dropped math growth for the children around our country down to what most would consider the lowest possible thing that could ever be normal into maybe the highest area of what could be below normal. 35 is kind of right that tipping point between the lowest end of acceptable growth and the highest end. Now what's important is to understand that was a 35 when you looked at the entire school year of last year. And we know that the first half of the school year was pretty normal. So if you had the first half of the school year running somewhere near 50 and the entire year came out at 35, that tells you how low our spring semester had to have been. Basically, if you start looking at different metrics, when it comes to math, basically what happened last year is a pause button got hit. Basically, when we shut down our schools, math growth stopped. Now, the good news is kids didn't start, regressing all that much, but they didn't grow any at all. So last year, in terms of math performance, was a really, really nationally, in some ways, lower growth type of one. Now, in the report, we'll list it grade by grade by grade. So, for example, I said that it's 35 overall for math. But I've also spoken about some of the grades that are more impacted. For example, fourth grade was pretty hard hit. Their SGP was below 35. I think it's like 32, 33, something like that. We will list it in detail across all the grades, but here's where it starts adding up. So let's look at fourth grade as an example, looking at their math. Fourth grade math performance is down 10 percentile points. Their SGP is down 17 points to somewhere a little bit below 35. I don't have the table right in front of me. And then you're about to see another metric, because what we wanted to do was we wanted to translate these drops into an estimate of how many weeks of instruction would it take to catch kids up. So in grade 4 math, you'd need roughly 8 to 11 weeks of instruction to close the gap reflected by how much further students are behind this year. So we'll come back to that weekly metric in just a minute, but let's talk about how students are performing by subgroup, because there are a lot of predictions out there. And most of the predictions went like this: it is highly likely that the most disadvantaged students will be disproportionately impacted. And sadly, much of that came true. So let me show you what we will be able to show you in the report, and I'll give you a peek to a couple of metrics. Now notice the 0 line here. That means no difference between how kids were performing this fall and what we expected them. You see by the presence of a whole lot of white space to the left of that line that there's a whole lot more instances where kids' performance drop, because anything to the left is lower than we would have hoped for. Anything to the right is better than we would have hoped for. So right up at the top, you see reading and math overall. So this is not disaggregated. This is all kids, all 3+ million kids in reading, all 2+ million kids in math. And as I've already said, reading was 1 to 2 percentile ranks behind overall, really 1 when you look at it overall, and math was 7 behind. Now, down the left side, you see all of the demographics that we will be able to report on. We will be able to talk about race and ethnicity. We'll be able to talk about whether the student was classified as being a special education student or an English language learner. We will report on those locations of the school. Is this a rural school, a small town school, or a more suburban or urban school? We'll also be able to talk about whether it's private or Catholic or public. And there's a little one that got cut off down the bottom, just formatting here, I apologize. We will be looking at whether the school is Title I or not, which is a really good proxy for parental income. So let me show you what it looks like when you look at the school location. Now remember, I'm showing you this blue line here. That line drawn right through the overall average, that's the overall average for the country now, not disaggregated. And so what you see is, if you look at math, the rural and small town schools dropped a little bit more than their urban and suburban counterparts. So I'll give you the exact numbers there. Math overall is -7. The rural and the small town schools were -9, while the suburban and urban counterparts to them were -6. Okay. So that prediction that it's likely that maybe students who just couldn't get online, that seems to have come true. Again, we can't say that it's causal, but we can say there is a difference in performance and a difference in the change of performance year over year based on whether or not the students are in rural small town schools or suburban and urban ones. Now, I've given you a lot of information, so it's probably time for me to check in with Jan and see if anything came up on chat, whether folks were posing any questions. So Jan, let's take the temperature and see how folks are doing out there. What do you have for me?
Sure. When you reported SGP of 50, and then in math, in the most affected grades, SGP of 35,
35.
the question is that the median or the average?
That is the median SGP.
Median SGP. Thank you.
Any other questions? I will tell you, we are, again, the report release date is the 1st of December. We have been meeting with several departments of education and other key leaders to kind of preview some of this. It'll be an interesting conversation when the full thing is out, because we'll get a better picture for what's going on. Now, I wanted to show you the school location demographic, because the rest of it is probably not all that surprising. Title I schools were more impacted than schools that are not Title I. Private and parochial schools did a little bit better than public schools in terms of the other racial, ethnic demographics. most of those things that you would have thought to have played out did play out. Now here's the good news. Even though some groups are a little bit further behind and some groups are a couple of points ahead, the variances aren't huge. Think about like a car accident where the car gets hit and it gets slid over. The whole car moves over. And when we look at kids across the entire country, you realize that some kids are high performing. They have a percentile rank of above 65. Some kids are, kind of right there in the middle. They're performing a percentile rank anywhere between 35 and 65, and some kids are below 35. They're the lowest performing kids. What COVID did is it impacted us all fairly consistently. Now, plus or minus a point or two. But when you understand the larger performance gaps that exist out there, the impact of COVID so far hasn't been all that significant. COVID has impacted both high performing students, average performing students, and low performing students with a little degree of variance, but overall the hits were felt by everybody. And so I don't know whether that's good news or bad news. At least it's a bit more of an equitable hit in some ways. But ultimately, after we talk about negative 10 or 7 percentile points in a given grade, what does that mean? What does that mean about how much work we have to do or how far we have to go? So it brings us to another poll question, which again, the routine is chatting with Jan on Whova. Here's what I'd like you to make a prediction about. Think about the most impacted grades for math. I told you that's the worst impact. Generally somewhere around grades 4 and 5, 3 and 6 still have legitimate impacts as well. Those grades that have been the most impacted, and I told you they are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 percentile ranks behind. How many weeks of instruction do you think it would take to catch up the grades where things have been the most impactful? Do you think they're relatively on track? That's less than 3 weeks to do whatever we need. Do you think they're in the range of needing 4 to 7 weeks to catch them up, or is it 8 to 11, or is it more than 12? Jan, what's everybody saying out there in the feed?
Well, they're pondering at the moment.
Yeah.
7 and 8, grades 7 and 8. Mm-hmm.
Okay. How many weeks do you think it's going to take? So your answers, you can say 4 to 7, 8 to 11, or 12 or more. Those are your 3 options. 4 to 7, 8 to 11, 12 or more. How much time do you think it's going to take us to catch up from the worst COVID slide elements? What do you see, Jan?
We have a plus 12, more than 12 weeks.
Plus 12s. You got some plus 12s?
Another one. Another one for plus 12. 8 to 11, plus 12.
Yeah. And here's what I'll tell you. It's pretty safe to assume some plus 12s, because if it wasn't the case, we wouldn't have put it on the chart as an option. But ultimately, the question is, how many grades are like that? I mean, do we have more than 12 weeks for 6 out of the 8 grades we looked at, or is it 1 or 2? What is it? So let's begin to get something around the scale. Now, before I show you the answer to that, here's what you need to realize. A metric of weeks of growth is an approximation. Statistically, there is no perfect way to do this. We cannot say with the precision of, say, plus or minus 1 week. We can't say that, grade 1 is 1 week behind, grade 2 is 2 weeks behind. The formulas cannot be that precise. As a result, what you saw was we're going to be presenting things in those ranges, basically ranges of 3 weeks. And here's the reality. When it comes to math, again, the most impacted areas, there are 3 grades, not grade 3. There are 3 different grade levels where it's going to take about 8 to 11 weeks of instruction to catch kids up to where they normally would have been as they started the year. And sadly, worse than that, there are 2 other grade levels, again, not grade 2, 2 other grade levels where it's going to take more than 12 weeks to catch them up to where we normally would have had them. So I told you we're reporting on grades 1 through 8. You add up the 2 and the 3, you get to 5. All of that equals a pretty significant amount of work that we're going to have to do around mathematics. We definitely have some ground to cover, because let's be clear, that is how many weeks of instruction would it take to catch you up to the starting point. If I say that someone's 8 to 11 weeks behind, that's kind of like saying, well, we're going to start the marathon, the firing pistol is going to go off, and you have to stand at the starting block for 8 to 11 minutes before you start running. Okay. Well, that means that if you're going to catch up with the norms, if you're going to catch up with the reality of where we want you to be, you not only have to run the ground, but you have to run that much faster to catch up to where you need it to be. So when we understand that some grade levels for 12, I'll tell you, they go up to maybe 13 or 15 weeks behind. And we know that a typical school year is 36 weeks. We've got some work to do. In fact, one of the policy discussions that we'll probably have to precipitate from this is, might we not need more than a year to catch some kids up to where they need to be? So again, back to our grade 4 example, they were the most impacted, or one of the most impacted. They're in the 8 to 11 week range. There are 2 other grades that are a little bit worse off. But again, if you add it all up for grade 4, they're down 10 percentile ranks. Their SGP dropped by 17 points. They're 8 to 11 weeks behind. And I'm using grade 4 as an example, but these same metrics will be available to you for every grade up to grade 8, and in both reading and math. What this means, because we said in the title, how do you make sense of scores in these unusual times? So what that means is, if you were looking at your own school or district data year over year, and your kids have dropped 9 percentile points, and then you see that the country as a whole has dropped 10, you're pretty close in there in the average. Maybe there's some of you that just did absolutely stellar work, and you look at things year over year and you see that your percentile points only dropped by 5 points. Well, then pat yourself on the back. The students in your school didn't experience slide as much as other kids did around the nation. We want these metrics to be a reference point for you, so that as you are looking at your own interim assessment data, you have something nationally to compare yourselves to. However, that's not where this thing stops. We do not need an education one more report that frames and admires a problem. Okay, we don't need that. We've got too many reports out there that say, here's a problem. We need things that tell us, here's your reality and here's how to fix it. And so we're going to offer a couple of interesting things. One is, we're going to give you some information about the specific skills that kids may need because of these gaps being behind. Let me show you let me explain to you what you're seeing on the screen here. At Renaissance, when we work on our assessments, we take your state standards and we break them down, and we build what folks call a learning progression, a very highly sequenced order of skills, the ideally teachable order for kids to learn skills, in this case in mathematics. So across the bottom, you see the order that the content experts, and we work with folks around the country in agencies that do standards and content and universities. This is the order across the bottom that they put the skills in. Up the side is a rating of how difficult the skill is for kids. And you see a faint yellow line that kind of makes its way through the cloud of all those skills. That's the line of best fit. Okay. Basically, what that's saying is, when you correlate the order of a skill with its difficulty, the path usually follows that orange line. But what you also see is some skills are above that line, and as you go up, it means that it's harder, and other skills are below that line. Now, most of them cluster right around the line, a little bit above, a little bit below. But I'm sure that your eye might have been drawn to some of these ones which were outliers. In other words, they are not just a little bit above, they're kind of significantly above the line. When we started looking at it, what this means is there are certain skills that we teach, in this case, in grade 4 and into grade 5, that are in those grade levels. And because they fall above this line, they are particularly hard for kids. And so we asked our content team, well, what are those skills? And they came back and said, well, it's fraction content. And you know what? Any teacher that's ever dealt with teaching kids at the 5th grade level fractions, you know that's just tough, tough, tough stuff. And also remember that it was grades 4 and grade 5 were the most impacted. So we're zooming in now. So what are those skills? And you see that sort of light, faint green color. That's the fraction content. What it's showing us here is there's some fraction content in grade 4. It's not all that hard for kids. It's a little bit underneath the line, but man, oh man, when they walk in the door of the 5th grade classroom, fraction content is very, very difficult. Think about what's happening there. Students are beginning to be asked to multiply and divide fractions, and they're dealing with very much unlike denominators and mixed numbers, and that's really, really tough stuff. So basically what the report is going to do is it's going to tell you more information about these skills that are outliers. For example, this one right here probably jumped into your mind. This is area of a rectangle, okay? But let's talk about why that is so hard for kids. First of all, they just learned to multiply in the first half of 3rd grade. Prior to 3rd grade, everything that you do around geometry is measurement, the length of things. So in 3rd grade, late in the year, when you're asked to be able to figure out the area of a rectangle, you're actually bringing 2 things together. You're bringing together a completely new concept of geometry and an operation that is relatively new to students, multiplication. And that's just a really, really hard thing to do. So in the report, basically what we're going to do is we're going to draw a line somewhere plus or minus an acceptable range. And then anything for a grade level that falls outside of that range, we'll tell you exactly what it is so that you know some of the hardest skills that you need to impart to help catch kids up from where they might be struggling. Point being, fraction content was always hard. In any year, it would be hard, but it was particularly hard last year because not only was it hard content, but you were trying to impart it as teachers while you were physically separated from the kids and figuring out all manner of new things. There's a great resource. We did this in a session yesterday, so I won't go into it, but if you go to renaissance.com/focus skills with a dash between those 2 words, I'm sure Jan will get it into chat for you. If you go there, it will list the most essential skills in reading and math at every grade level. So if you were trying to catch kids up, this is the stuff you must cover. And stuff that is not there, you can afford to be a bit more flexible about. This site will list for you at each grade level in reading math the most essential stuff, which is really good guidance when you're trying to catch up kids. There's a recorded session from yesterday for this conference that you can look at, or if you go to that landing page, there is a recorded video there that will walk you through that site and how to use it. But let me pause again and check in with Jan and see if there's any questions that came in. Jan?
We do not have any questions at this time, but please submit if you've got one right now. And I did put the focus skill hyperlink there for everyone.
Yes, super, super resource. There's even a little booklet you can download. You can choose your state and you can download a list of the most essential reading and the most essential math skills for all grade levels. So there's a great little PDF that's there. Again, when you get there on the landing page, there's a blue bar that has a webinar. You can watch that one or watch the recording of my RAPSA session from yesterday, and it'll give you a great overview of this. But we're getting ready to wrap up. You know, there's not a single piece of research that answers every question. And often when you seek to find certain answers, it serves to raise new questions. And so I want to let you know the questions that we cannot currently answer about the COVID slide, things that are going to have to remain open for a while, and what our plan is to find those answers. I told you in the very beginning that these were the questions that we set out to answer in how kids are performing, and we did find the answer. Answer number 1, does performance this year, how does it compare? It's about 1 to 2 percentile points down in reading. It's about 7 percentile points on average down in math. Is there a greater spread? Slightly larger, but generally speaking, it's like that car accident that kind of nudged us all over. Are there particular grades or subjects? Absolutely. Math is more impacted than reading. And within math, grades 4 and 5 took the hardest hits, closely followed by 3 and 6 and 7, and even 8 had a pretty hard hit as well. To what extent are particular subgroups impacted? You'll have the full reporting there. You'll see the averages. There are some demographic subgroups that are as many as maybe 3 additional percentile points behind the norm. And are there variances between schools according to whether they're in more rural or suburban areas? Yes, it does appear there's a bit of a spread there. But here is the next question. And this is something that we're going to answer through follow-ups. What's really important after we understand the gaps that have been created is, and how are kids growing this year? So in the middle of the year, after most schools have given their middle of the year winter screening, we will put out a supplement to this report that tells you how are kids growing during the first half of the year. Because it's one thing to say that a gap of a certain size has been created, but what is happening to that gap as we get kids back to school? Is the gap shrinking? That would be the outcome I really would hope for. Or maybe gaps have been created and they're not getting any wider. So we're moving kids ahead, but not at a fast enough rate to begin to close the gap. Or maybe the worst case happens, which I hope it is not. But it is possible that we have created gaps, or I say we have created, the gaps have been created by the current situations. And that over the year, we're just not growing as much as we do in a normal academic year because we're continuing to have all these disruptions. And maybe those gaps are getting wider. We cannot know. We will not know until the winter. But in the winter, we will issue a supplement that will talk about growth. And it will talk about to what extent are these gaps changing. And then at the end of the year, we'll do the same thing. Once everybody's done their spring screening, we will analyze that data and we will issue the final piece that will look at growth over the entire year and kind of summarize and where are we at the end of the 2021 academic year in terms of mitigating the impacts of COVID. So it is a conversation that will continue throughout the year. What actions can you take right now? Again, the report will be out on the 1st. I would suggest that you go into your own assessments, whatever they are, and you kind of get your baseline. You know, what's your mean percentile for the starting of this year and how does that compare to the past? We have a blog, if you go to renaissance.com/baseline, that talks about how to go in and get your baseline. If you use STAR, it's going to give you all the videos of how to do it. There's a little template there. If you don't use STAR, you can still fill it in because it basically asks you to get your percentile ranks year over year. Last thing is this. As COVID has done in so many ways, it's bringing new stuff to us. We are getting requests every single day around what I would call new demographics. So 10, 15, 20 years ago, we broke down schools based on whether they were Title I or not, where they were located, the profiles of the students that were there. But we're getting phone calls now that we never got before. People are saying, can I break my data down based on whether the students are getting remote, hybrid, or in-person instruction? Because now it is not uncommon for all 3 models to be occurring at the same time in the same district. No one ever asked about that a year ago, because a year ago it was just that they all came right to the building and they had face-to-face instruction. Now we're getting asked to break it down based on that. Can we break down our data, do these 3 models so that we can see that maybe students are growing more or less when they receive a certain manner of delivery? Beyond that, people are beginning to track internet access. Do our kids have internet access at home? There's 50.7 million children school age in our country, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 16 million of them do not have adequate connectivity to do extensive amounts of remote or distance learning. So roughly 30% of the kids out there either don't have connectivity or don't have a device. And that's a new demographic to track, because it could be that those students that are not growing, it has nothing to do with who they are or anything about their abilities. It's just that they cannot connect or plug in. And so people are asking to break that down. You see up on the icon there, we have a little platform called Schoolzilla that helps people bring in data from multiple sources. Here's what I would say. If you have data warehouses or school visualization things, this is the year to use them. This is the year to use all of your data, because we have no summative data from last year. And nobody knows what's going to happen to our state test this year. It's a coin toss right now, whether we will or will not have those tests. But what that means is if you're going to have any normative information, any percentile ranks or grade equivalents or SGPs, if you're going to have any of that, it's going to come from your interim assessments. And if you are looking at those things, one of the things we clearly need to do is disaggregate our data in as many ways possible, because it's very possible that there can be some very stark realities. There can be some students who have been disproportionately impacted, hiding behind the averages. It's one thing to say that we're down 7 percentile points in math overall. It's quite another thing to say, but there are populations of kids that are down 10 or 11 percentile ranks. Who are they and where are they? Because we cannot address equity unless we know who they are to go get to them and get them the services they need to maximize their potential. That's what I had. So we've got a couple minutes here for questions. So let's see anything that came up in chat or anything else that you're wondering about. Again, and we'll paste it in there as well, renaissance.com/performing to sign up to get a copy of the report emailed to you when it releases. And we'll be posting some videos and blogs and all sorts of resources there to engage in this conversation throughout the year about what is the nature of the COVID slide and to what effect are we mitigating it as we go throughout the year. Jan, anything that came up in chat?
Sure, a couple I've already answered in chat,
Okay.
but one, will we be able to look at students into 3 different models, in person, remote, and hybrid? You
Yeah.
addressed that as well. And
Yeah.
then another question. Oh, go ahead.
You deal with that one, you said?
Right.
Okay, very good. Okay.
But go ahead if you want to say more about that. And then there was another question about, will the report address participation rates as well? So a lot of things about what else can be done with the report. So I have mentioned in chat, but I don't know if you want to also mention the follow-up pieces that will be coming out and what we're looking at.
Yeah. So, you asked about, for example, participation rate or the rates or these 3 manners of instruction. That is not something that we can do on the national level because we simply do not have that data. You, however, do. And so we encourage you to think about those metrics and to enter them into your systems. I will say, like platforms like Schoolzilla, things that allow you to integrate data from multiple sources and depict it graphically and break it down by different demographics, those are going to be really important this coming year. So if you already have a great platform that helps you warehouse and visualize and analyze your data, be prepared to use it this year more than you have historically in the past, because we have more of a need for information to come from that interim level, because the summative stuff is not coming. If you do not have a data warehousing and visualization platform, I would encourage you to consider looking for one. Again, we cannot address equity gaps if we don't know where they are. And the way that we find them is making sure that our assessment data systems talk with our student information systems that have all the demographics in there, and that our platforms are flexible enough to add new fields like participation or manner of instruction, remote, in person, hybrid, or connectivity. So if you don't have a platform like that, I'd be looking for one, because I'm not a gambling kind of person, but I think it's very realistic to assume that we have a good chance of going another year without summative testing data, which then means 2 years of no summative data. And once the summative tests are offline for a year or two, it'll take them a couple of years before they go back online with growth measures. To the point that is that if you want normative scores and some normative growth data, it's going to have to come from the interim level, because the summative systems are just not going to be online enough to produce that information for you. So I think those are going to be really important tools for us in the short term. And as Jan said too, the follow-up pieces, again, that's the middle of the year follow-up on growth, and the end of the year follow-up on growth as well. We're also going to explore remote versus in-person testing. We're collecting that information now. You will notice in the report when you get it, it always says, take grades 1 through 3 with a little bit of a grain of salt. Sometimes parents just help out too much. If you got a lot of kids taking your tests from home, there is reason to believe that you may be seeing some inflated scores, particularly in grades 1 through 3, because sometimes some parents just cannot help but help. And we need to be aware of that and quantify that over time, which we're seeking to do. Other questions, Jim?
We don't have any more here. I think you've addressed the participation rates. Yes, that discussion continued, so it's a strong discussion. But no other questions at this time.
All right. Well, that's what I had for you. Again, there's how to sign up to get the report. We do hope you will join us in this dialogue because, again, I think for you to interpret what you were seeing in your own percentile scores, whether they're coming from STAR or another assessment, you need to understand what's being seen on the national level. That gives you a reference point to understand if what you are seeing at your district level is on par with, ahead of, or behind the national level. And I think that's a really critical piece as we figure out how to make our way through, this second of likely 2 very disruptive academic years. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll turn things back over to Deborah to wrap us up. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Jean and Jen, for that really informative presentation. Thank you, participants, for joining us. Don't forget to complete your session feedback. There's sponsor exhibit booths at lunchtime. And the next session in this room will begin at 11:30, and that is Young and Essential Workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.